It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. And this show is brought to you by Archival Revival. Okay, check out archivalrevival.blogspot.com. And you can reach them over at archival.revival@gmail.com. And what they are is they're a film preservation company. They want to preserve old 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter Christian films. These old films you used to watch when you were a kid down there in Bible school, or Sunday school they used to call it. Sunday school and vacation Bible camp, all that kind of stuff there. These old vintage films. They're deteriorating in church attics and basements. So they want to buy those films from you. So if you go to your church or in your closet, whatever, you got one of these old 35 millimeter films, those big tin cans, 16 millimeter films, contact archival.revival@gmail.com, and they want to make you an offer for those films. So they'll buy those films from you. I also want to put out a little plea there, a pledge for American Freedom Radio. They're urgently requesting donations at this point right now. American Freedom Radio. You can go to AmericanFreedomRadio.com and check out the website. There's a donate button there. American Freedom Radio has been around a long, long time. Okay, and then there was a little break in the broadcasting, then they came back up, and it's been a struggle since they've been back on the air. Lack of sponsors and support. So we really need listener support to keep these shows on the air, like Vinny Eastwood and Jack Blood and my good friend Pierce Redmond there, and hey, good old Nico House too. Nico House comes on right before me. I just had him on the show last night. Okay. Got a fascinating show for you today, as usual. Okay, it's a brand new book, just came out in June. I think it was June 8th. Trine Day, good old Chris Milligan over there at Trine Day Press, and Julie Cox, who always helps me book my guests when I'm looking for a good guest to get. Remember the Liberty, almost sunk by treason on the high seas. We have Philip F. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, are you there?
Yes, sir. I sure am.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Why don't you tell us about yourself? Who is Philip Nelson?
Well, I was raised in the Midwest in Indiana. I went to college in Wisconsin, and I lived my life. Well, after college, I went into the Peace Corps for 2 years, and then when I came out, they had just changed the draft in a rather drastic way to go to a lottery system.
Right.
And I was fortunate enough to draw a high number, so I missed the opportunity to go to Vietnam. And that's, it was sort of engineered, I guess. But I suspected the new president, Lyndon Johnson, of, all along, actually, even before JFK was assassinated. He had been in the newspapers in 1962 and 63 repeatedly with scandal after scandal involving Billy Salesses and then who was called Bobby Baker. And so when Johnson became president, I was always suspicious of him, and that I guess I still am, aren't I? Yeah. And so after a life in the insurance business, I was wound up in the property casualty insurance business, working for two different companies, and had gotten to the vice presidential level in the process of these companies, both of which sort of, I was downsized twice because these companies began floundering because of mismanagement at the top. And so anyway, that is what it is and was, and I was fortunate to have survived that, I guess, and I went into business for myself after that for a few years, and then in 2007, I made a decision that I wanted to begin researching the JFK assassination for starters. And that actually came about as a result of seeing the videos back in 2003, on the series "The Men Who Killed Kennedy." When I saw, especially the very last video called "The Guilty Men," starring none other than Lyndon B. Johnson, and I was fascinated by that topic because I had always had the suspicion in the back of my mind that he had to be somehow involved. Well, I shouldn't say always. In the immediate aftermath, for the first 2 years or so, I did not want to believe it was anything other than a lone nut, and it was just a frightening thought. I think I shared with most contemporary people who lived through that. It was just too frightening to even think. So it was an unthinkable thought for a lot of us. But as other people, other early researchers got into it and began identifying all the anomalies and the unexplained coincidences, and then many people started turning up murdered to a much greater degree than would realistically, be plausible.
Sure.
And I had growing doubts that, the full story was out there. So I began an intensive review of all of the literature of the time. At the time, 2007 and then 2010 is when I first self-published LBJ, the mastermind of the JFK assassination. Within a few months, a New York publisher picked it up. I was going to go to them after I had some numbers to show them, but they came to me, and that was Skyhorse, came to me, and it was October of 2010, and we negotiated a contract, and they published the book then in 2011. When they did that, they took out a lot of the material that was post-JFK assassination. And I agreed to that with the proviso that it was understood that I was going to write a second book, and that would be focused on LBJ and the years of his presidency and later. And so that was done. And so in 2014, the book LBJ, From Mastermind to the Colossus, was published, also by Skyhorse. Now that book included 2 chapters dedicated to the Liberty. And I thought I was done with this story. However, it turned out that I was not quite done, because I found out many other things in the ensuing months and years. And I decided that it needed another book dedicated to just that incident, what they call an incident. It was a massacre. It was an atrocity. But anyway, so I managed to become acquainted with 3 of the survivors who agreed to go in with me on this book and become co-authors. And they are Phil Turney, Ernie Gallo, and Ron Kukl. They were all survivors, and they all contributed to this new book. Probably close to 50% of the book were stories coming from them, either in their own words or paraphrased by me. And the remaining had to do with putting the context, the overall context, into place, and to try to bring some coherence to an otherwise very complicated story. That's just full of a lot of details that detract from writing something that is an easy read. But that was always my goal, to make it an easy read, and I believe we've accomplished that.
Well, let me ask you this. These 3 men you described a minute ago, what was their role on the USS Liberty? Okay, well, Ernie Gallo, who is presently the president of the Liberty Veterans Association, he was in the cryptology division. In other words, he worked for NASA. Okay. And even though they were all Navy men, that some of them were assigned to working, in this top secret cryptology
section, and that's where he worked. Also, Ron Kukl was similarly working there, but he was had a more of a job in the machinery that ran all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, and Phil Turney was basically a fireman. He was damage control and trained in all the ways that can be trained to put out fires and or leaks or whatever was going on. So he was very intimately familiar with all of the mechanics of that ship. And in the aftermath, Ron Kukl was he was a chief petty officer, and he was put in charge once they got to Malta. He was put in charge of going into that CT compartment in the front. That's the only place where the seawater managed to get in and drown everybody who was in there, and they were all in the CT division, cryptologists. And when that happened, when the torpedo exploded there or outside the ship, we'll get into that later, but it killed 25 more men. There were already 9 dead on the upper decks who were killed in the immediate attack. I mean, when the fighter jets came in and started shooting up the upper deck, and subsequently dropping napalm and continuing the cannon fire and the missiles and everything else. Well, nine guys were killed there. So altogether, 34 men were killed. 174 were injured. Some of them very, very critically. That it was amazing they were able to survive at all because of the enormous injuries. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But give me an idea now. I know very little bit about the story. What I know is that the USS Liberty was attacked by Israel, supposedly by accident. What was, at the time, what was the official story that came out?
Well, the official story was, where do I start with that? It was basically a huge cover-up. In other words, none of the truth was acknowledged, and all of it was patched together, basically lies. And that's not just me talking, by the way.
Sure.
I am referencing when I make that assertion. That is precisely what the guy who was put in charge of writing the Court of Inquiry's report, Captain Ward Boston Jr., was put in charge of that, and he was working under a rear admiral named Isaac Kidd. And together, the two of them were given 7 days to complete this report, and they were told exactly what the report was going to say, and it was going to say that it was a complete accident, and it was just a very unfortunate situation, and that was the end of it. That was their orders, and those orders came from Lyndon Johnson through the Joint Chiefs and Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, down through John S. McCain, Admiral John McCain II. He was the father of the current senator in Arizona. And then from McCain, it came on down through the chain of command, basically personified by this Isaac Kidd, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, and Captain Ward Boston. They conducted interviews with all the survivors, and in the process, after they had interviewed them, and this was actually all these interviews that I'm referring to now were done personally by this Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, and he, after he interviewed them, he was interviewing them in groups of 5 or 6. So you go from one group to the next, and he would put on the same presentation. Basically, he would. This was in the days immediately after the attack. Now, this is within the first week. They were conducted while the ship was being moved from where it was attacked in the Mediterranean to Malta, where it was scheduled. It was then scheduled to be repaired. So on the way over there, he would conduct these interviews with 5 or 6 guys. We would walk in and expect to be saluted as a rear admiral. which of course they were officer on deck, and they all came to attention and saluted and all that. And then he would remove his stars from his collar, and he clinked them on a metal table. He made sure that there was a clink because they all repeated this same story.
Wow.
And they also said that his collar had holes in them where he would, could easily put them back in the same exact hole, and then we'd take them out again. Every single time he did the same act, because what he was trying to convey there was that he's just a regular guy. Don't consider me an admiral. I'm just like you. I'm a chief petty officer, or I'm a sailor, or whatever. And whoever he was talking to. In other words, he talked to these guys in groups. He had started with the officers, of course, the captain and the lieutenants and all the commanders and so forth. And then after that, he conducted all of these with the other survivors until each and every one were subjected to this meeting. Anyway, so after he heard them and their stories, he encouraged them to he was like a favorite uncle or father figure and so on, and he was just really down to earth during this period, and he encouraged them to just spill their guts and just say whatever they wanted, and that's what they did. And then at the end he would say, well, does anybody have any questions? And so some of them would, in fact, Phil Turney, who told this story in the book, stated that yes, he raised his hand and said, why weren't we given any help? What happened to the help that was supposed to be? We got our SOS out, but there was no help coming. Well, and we're going to return to that part later, but for the purposes here, I'm just trying to explain what happened, in these interviews. So yes, he at that point he put his stars back on his collars, and he returned to being an admiral. He says, "Now I'm an admiral again," and of course that meant show me the proper deference and don't get in my face about any of this stuff anymore. Right. And effectively telling them that, well, not effectively, he told them basically to forget everything that they've just told him. It was nice that they got it all off their chests and everything, but now you're not going to talk to anybody anymore about any of this. And that was an order, and that anybody who doesn't follow that order is subject to a prison term. And then he would say, at the end of that, he would say a prison term or worse, never identifying what worse that a prison term might be. But they all imagined what it might be, and anyway, they got the message. And by the way, they were told that they couldn't even discuss it amongst themselves, one to one. That was off limits too. And above all, they couldn't say anything to any of their families, their wife, their children, their mother, their father. Nobody. That's who they could talk to.
Now, would that be standard in a typical Navy investigation?
No. This is all the earmarks of a absolute brutal cover-up. You can imagine that these guys were just shot at, and some of them almost mortally wounded, and yet they were told that they could never talk to anybody about this. It's like, PTSD on steroids.
Right.
As Ray McGovern, I need to credit Ray McGovern with that one. He wrote the foreword of the book, and he's an ex-CIA analyst, so he knows his stuff. And that was a very good way to put that, because that's exactly what it was. And some of these guys, and in these days, you have to understand, back then, the Navy didn't even recognize PTSD. There was nothing in any of their manuals about that. So
it's more shell shock, they used to say.
Right.
Or
they were
cowards,
on their own. They were expected to deal with it and be a man about it. And don't you ever talk to anybody about it. So that's what they did. So many of them had failed marriages as a result of that. They went back and they had this torment inside of them that they couldn't. Some of them even tried to talk to their pastors about it. The confidence was expected that they could at least talk to them, and they would never reveal this. And even some of those pastors would just turn their backs on them. They'd say, "You're just crazy. I can't deal with this. It didn't happen." Because some of them actually contacted the Navy and to ask about it. No, that's just ridiculous. That didn't happen. So it was just a very brutal and absolute cover-up that was conducted. And again, that is not my words. That's Ward Boston. He wrote the report, and for over 30 years, 37 years to be exact, he kept his mouth shut, and he did not come forward and reveal the truth until 2004. And in fact, his report was done as a result of a book that had just been published by a guy named A.J. Crystal, who tried to repeat all of those lies that had been in the original Navy Court of Inquiry and put it in a book, along with a lot of other lies and myths and so forth. And his book is still out there. I mean, it's been totally destroyed by critics seeking the truth, and it's not destroyed, but it's still out there. But it's completely discredited. Well, let's just put it that way. I know of nobody who. Well, there are a lot of people who pretend they still support it. John McCain, the senator.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. Yeah.
And whoever wants to make sure that the original myth stands, well, of course they're going to cite A.J. Crystal's book, and they're going to cite a book by the former ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., named Michael Oren, who wrote his own turgid book saying basically the same thing. And so it just happens that in 2004, just 2 weeks after Ward Boston did this, he had to correct the record because he was furious with having seen A.J. Crystal's book and seen what had happened, that he was just adopting all these lies, that Ward Boston, along with Admiral Isaac Kidd, had documented, so-called, with quotes around it, and put in this Naval Court of Inquiry report, a report, by the way, which ignored much of the incriminating testimony taken from the actual officers who witnessed such things as the firing, the Israeli torpedo boats firing, at the lifeboats that were being deployed, because the captain had ordered a prepare to abandon ship because of when the torpedoes started flying, not flying, but coming. They thought they were goners at that point. So they put out the lifeboats, and the Israeli motor torpedo boats fired at them and destroyed them.
Let me ask you something to back up just a tiny little bit. At the time this happened, because this is enormous, 34 dead and 100 and something you said injured. What was being reported on the news, on TV and the radio right after this happened?
Right. That's an excellent question, because what happened is it was reported that there was this big accident. There was an unfortunate misidentification, and Israel thought this ship was actually an an Egyptian ship and an Egyptian warship. Okay, when in fact the only ship that they could even reference was an aging Egyptian horse ferry that had been scheduled for destruction. It was not even seaworthy.
Yeah, I was going to say, what kind of navy did Egypt have in those days? Nothing, right?
I guess they started out with something, but and we're going to get back into this one too.
Okay.
You have to remember, this is the fourth day of a 6-day war. As far as Egypt was concerned, the war was over, and it's important to understand that, because their complete air force, about 90% of it, was taken out in a surprise attack launched by Israel on the morning of June the 5th. Okay, now I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, because I'd like to go back and just kind of restart with a description of the attack itself, how how it was launched and how it was synchronized, and how one wave after the other followed suit over a period of 2.5 hours. Well, a period of 2 hours of solid, attack, and then there was another half an hour where two huge combat helicopters hovered over the ship, and with ropes just dropped down to the ship's deck, and they were ready to rappel down these ropes, all these combat guys, and kill off the crew, sink the ship, and then be done.
Really?
Yeah, that was, and everybody on the ship was frightened that was imminent. However, because of the presence of a Russian ship that was coming towards them, it was either that or their fear that the Sixth Fleet had been notified and they were going to be launching a squadron of fighter jets to save the Liberty. One or the other. We don't know exactly because all the records have been expunged or just whatever.
Well, then let me ask you a question. Now, so this was a coordinated attack by land and air, by
yes.
sea and air. Now, how long would it have taken?
Land.
I'm sorry, I meant by sea and air. But the thing is, how long would it have taken the Israelis to plan something like that?
That's a very good question, and the record shows from other authors. Now, I'm what my book does here, as I've done in two other cases in those previous books, is I've consolidated the findings of numerous authors before me into one kind of a unique book that blends it all together and makes it into a readable story that makes sense. I try to make sense out of all of this. And one of the other previous authors, in fact, he was not only an author of a book called Operation Cyanide, and that book, that title came from the part of the plan that had to do with the sinking of the ship. That was the Liberty. That was a subpart of a much larger plan called Frontlet 615. And that's Frontlet 615 stood for, it was a title that eventually became known as the 6-Day War. In other words, that's what it was all about. It was starting this war between Israel and Egypt and portraying it as though Egypt caused it.
Right.
That was Egypt that had done all the provocations, which was exactly opposite of the truth.
So how long do you think it took the Israelis to plan this?
I think the plan germinated in 1965, and it lasted until it was deployed in June of 67. So they're talking about at least 2 years.
Wow.
Now, it was not just the Israeli military. It was also, and there are records which prove this assertion. It's not me rattling on about something I can't prove. Okay. I can prove it, and others have proven it before me. That it was started. That is, the planning had to begin in 1965 because by 1966 there were already U.S. military, special forces, and others in place in Israel, training their officers for what would become this war. Now, they didn't know exactly when it was going to be launched or anything like that, but the plan had to be in place. It had to have started in 1965 because all of that was going on in 1966. By mid-66, they were deployed. They were out there. They were doing that. And the other thing I want to get in here at this point is that the document that I'm referencing, when I just stated that it's not me talking, it's the other authors who have found this. Now, this document was found by accident by James Ennis. He was one of the survivors. He was an officer on the Liberty, and he wrote one of the first books, Assault on the Liberty. His book was written in 1979, I think published in 1980 in that area. And there's nothing about this document in his book. However, he does show it in a video done by the BBC. It's called a BBC documentary called Dead in the Water. your listeners really need to check that out. It's on YouTube. Just Google in "Dead in the Water" BBC documentary. It's an hour long, so you have to allocate time to watch it and be patient. It is a fascinating, it's an unbelievable video, done by the same author who wrote Operation Cyanide, Peter Houghton. Now he so anyway, my point was that James Ennis had found a document in the LBJ library of all places, and it was misfiled. It was filed in what was a set of the USS Liberty files, but it had to do with something from a group called the 303 Committee. Now that group was a special group that was akin to the National Security Council now, or back in Kennedy's time it was then referred to as the Special Group. And then it got changed to Special Group Augmented when Bobby Kennedy was put in charge of it. So it had a number of different names over the years. Under Nixon, it was called the 40 Group or something like that.
Yeah, so, Operation 40. Yeah.
But it was basically there to do plans on behalf of the president. So that whatever they did, they came directly from the president. So there's no question about what was going on there, and was basically at the behest of Lyndon Johnson.
So what was in the document?
Okay. The document he found, and it was just a single page, which he showed on this documentary. I think it's about the 46-minute mark on that documentary I just mentioned.
Okay.
But it lists the names of the attendees, and it was conducted. The meeting was conducted by an officer, a General Stakely, Ralph Stakely, I think his name was. Yes. And it referenced this operation that would be in the Mediterranean, and whoever had this particular copy of the minutes had written on it, or I don't know if it's the minutes or the agenda or whatever it was, it came out of this meeting, but they had written on there submarine in UAR waters. UAR was the acronym for United Arab Republic, and at the time that meant Egypt. Okay, so it was all related to, and it had the Frontlet 615 code on it, and it was supposed to be top secret. So the whole thing was an aberration that it was even found accidentally by James Ennis. It wasn't. I mean, he wasn't. He was doing he was doing his research, and he was doing very diligent research, right. I should add, in finding this. But it was always a mistake that was not supposed to be in that file. And
wait, and clarify for me again. What was in the document?
Well, it was just a very sketchy thing about this operation, and the fact that someone had written in there that there was going to be an operation, a sub-operation, involving a submarine in Egyptian waters, and that implicitly, you could probably say explicitly, meant the Liberty, because the document was in the Liberty files.
Right.
Okay. So, but the document was covering this other larger operation called Frontlet 615. And all it was a single piece of paper, I believe. And since it had not been in Ennis's book in 1980, I believe I had figured out that it had to be found by him around 1988, because it showed up in this later video. And I don't remember all the ways I estimated it was 1988, but it had to be in that area. It could have been 1990, but wherever. It was in there somewhere. And he showed it, and that's the only time it's been seen, because it's no longer available. And anyway, that's a document that references the 303 Committee, which is Johnson's basically planning committee that was conducting all these plans and had been involved with the Israeli leadership in compiling them and propagating them, whatever you want to call it. And it's important to note that the people on his committee were of the zealously Zionist mindset, who who wanted this to happen. We're talking about Abe Fortas. Now, he was a sitting Supreme Court justice, yet he was still on this committee because he was still acting as Johnson's right-hand man and legal counsel and friend and everything else. And so somehow he got into all this, and he was acting as the liaison to the Israeli leadership and coordinating all this. So there's no question about this. And Walt Rostow was another. McGeorge Bundy was on there. Robert McNamara, Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, was on there. And there were a couple of others. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that all of them who were on that committee knew about this little other operation called Operation Cyanide involving the Liberty. However, that's the group that was coordinating the larger plan. I'm sure that the Liberty aspect was held to a much tighter standard, probably just a few people. Certainly McNamara would have known about it.
Well, let me ask you this, because we're running out of time. We only have about another 20 minutes. Now, the thing is the Israeli motivation for attacking the Liberty was to provoke the U.S. into getting into the Six-Day War because they had already won that. What did they want us to get into?
Well, yeah, that's a very insightful and very pertinent comment you just made there, because as you suggest, or not suggest, you pointed out that this is the fourth day of a Six-Day War.
Right.
I believe that the Israelis had determined that it was no longer in their interest to actually sink the ship. I don't know. It's difficult to really sort all this out because all the secrets that are and the files are not available and so forth. But let's put it this way: up until the war started on June the 5th, 10 days early, mind you. At that point, the Liberty was still out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it had not gotten to its position. So when the war started, it was not in position. It was supposed to be in position. Oh. Because it was going to be the original plan for that plan called for the ship to be sunk on the very first day of the war, when all the action was going on against Egypt and the Egypt Air Force, and that they were bombing all the airports and so forth, our air bases, and destroying practically the entire Egyptian Air Force. And the idea was to sink that in the middle of that and then blame it on Egypt, and then the plan then called for a retaliation against Egypt, and that was a pretext that was set up for the very purpose of having Lyndon Johnson dispatch these airplanes, which you'll see if you watch the video, that I'm not making this up. It sounds outlandish, but it's true. There were two A-4 aircraft equipped with nuclear bombs headed for Cairo, okay, because that was the deal. That was supposed to be what was going to happen. The problem was the ship didn't sink as scheduled on this fourth day. At that point, after 4 days of basically Egypt's entire air force is already destroyed, I think Israel must have figured out that it was no longer plausible to put the blame on Egypt, and besides which they've already defeated Egypt. Well, they didn't need the U.S. to go there and use that as a pretext to become involved in a war that was already over with them. At that point, they were only fighting Syria and Jordan, and that was just an extended amount, that they wanted to secure additional territories, and that was rather easy pluckings, I guess, because it happened, and within 2 days, Egypt had defeated all three of these countries. Israel had defeated all three of these countries.
Right.
So to get back to your point, in my opinion, that's all it is my opinion, is that it doesn't make sense that Israel had any further motive for sinking that ship. And in fact, it would have been much more difficult for them to try to explain to anyone, including the national press or the international press, just what was going on there, and trying to blame Egypt for it. How could they do it? They have no airplanes left. And they've sort of
Right.
decommissioned their entire military because they'd already started peace negotiations at the UN in New York. It made no sense at all. So someone, I think, must have realized that and was trying to pull back. And also, it would explain how those more. Now, I'm going to quickly recap the nature of the attack. Okay.
Okay.
At 2 o'clock Sinai time, 3 Mystère French-built jet fighters approached the Liberty, on an attack formation, a triangular formation, and they hit it with all kinds of heat-seeking missiles, cannon fire, regular, aircraft guns, whatever, and they would take one pass after another. After the first pass, they would circle around, do a figure eight, come back, and do another pass, and fire at it again. And then after several passes, they left the scene. But they were then well-coordinated other airplanes that were slower, called Mystères. They came in just as the first crew left, and here's the Liberty down there, all shot up. There's no flag anymore at this point. The first aircraft took out the flag, but so the second set of aircraft were slower, and they could overfly and drop napalm packets all over the deck, and get that, set them afire with more gunfire. And this went on, for several passes. And then when they left the scene, this is only about 20 minutes into the attack, 25 minutes. And by that time, the Liberty sailors were able to go out. One hero, Terry Halberdier, actually got out and ran a coax cable across the decks in the middle of all this gunfire and so forth, and hooked up a cable to the only remaining transmitter that would still function, because all the rest of them were destroyed by the heat-seeking missiles. Well, the missiles never caught that one because it had not been turned on at the time, but there was no cable left to it anymore. So he had to do this, and as soon as he did, they got SOS messages out to the Sixth Fleet, calling for help. They were received, those SOS messages. And so at about 20 minutes after all the attack had started, the Sixth Fleet managed to get a number of aircraft, F-4 Phantom jets, dispatched to come to its aid, plus those 2 A-4s I already mentioned with the nuclear bombs on them headed for Cairo. All of this is in that video. You and your listeners should check that out.
And also,
But anyway,
don't forget, it's in your book too.
It's in my book too.
Remember
so,
the Liberty
yeah.
almost sunk by treason on the high seas, and there's a link to that book on my Facebook page, and we'll have it up in the Opperman Report bookstore as well. Continue, please.
Yes, it's just called "Remember the Liberty."
Right.
So anyway, the Phantom jets were on their way to the Liberty when word got back that they had to contact the White House. This is at about 8:20 in the morning, Washington time, and the word came back that they had already sent the aircraft out to come to the aid of the Liberty, and McNamara gets on the line and recalls them, says you've got to recall the airplanes, and the reason was that the Liberty had not sunk. They couldn't figure out why it had not sunk. Well, at that point, it had not even been hit by a torpedo. So, but the point is, all of this was going on in a rather chaotic way, because the real plan, the plan that would have happened on the first day of the war, had the ship been in place, could not be invoked. It became a mess. It was a colossal mess, and they didn't expect this radio message to get out. They were supposed to take all those antenna and the transmitters off. Right. It was not supposed to get that message out. So all of this was going on in this chaotic fashion, and it was just through a series of miracles. And the next part is, after all the airplanes were gone, Then the motor torpedo boats came in and started their firing their artillery at the Liberty as well. And then as they got closer to the ship, they fired 4 torpedoes, and all 4 of those torpedoes missed. When I just find that is amazing. If they didn't think that they could hit it because they weren't close enough, there was nothing there to prevent them from getting closer. They could have gotten as close as they wanted to get to ensure and guarantee that those torpedoes would hit, but they didn't. The first 4 did not hit at all. And a story that has been just now coming out and is covered in the book, and it's also on a YouTube documentary with a fellow named Larry Weaver who's testifying to this. Stated that the 5th torpedo, the one that actually hit the ship, was ordered to be fired by none other than Lyndon Johnson. He wanted the ship sunk. And I know this is difficult for most people to comprehend, but you have to hear me out here, because all of this is just almost incomprehensible, and most of it's unspeakable or even unthinkable. But it happened, and none of this is being made up. These are all true accounts, I believe, and including this part of the story. And the only thing that makes any sense to me, and as I've described it in the book, is that Lyndon Johnson, at that point in time, even though they all had collaborated for months and even years in the lead up, and it was a 50-50 proposition between the Israeli military leadership, Johnson's White House crew, the 303 committee next door, and the EOB, and the Pentagon, Robert McNamara, and etc. All of them, it was all need to know, of course. And I'm not saying everybody in all of those groups knew about the Liberty piece of it, but a lot of them knew about the war itself. But the Liberty piece, up until that first day, it would have been also mutually, desirable by both Johnson and Israel to have done this. However, because of the delay and the fact that the war had started before the Liberty was even on the scene, after that, Israel, I believe, lost any kind of a motive for seeing this out. I mean, it would have been almost impossible at this point to explain, to anyone how Egypt, could have been blamed for this attack.
And Johnson's motive was just get rid of the witnesses?
Well, that would have been accomplished. They would have gotten rid of the witnesses. And the rest of it, just the attack in general. But it was never the intention was never, clearly, it was never just to put it out of commission. It was to sink it and take everybody to the bottom of the Mediterranean, right. So that there would be no witnesses left to rebuke any of it. But it was, you have to understand, in 1967, first of all, you have to understand that Lyndon Johnson had a series of psychotic rages. I've documented those, referencing other works of other people, including some psychiatrists, psychologists, and people who witnessed his coming unglued at certain meetings, and that you have to factor that in. He had lost all rationality at various points, and this was even picked up by people like Arthur Schlesinger, and he repeated accounts from Richard Goodwin and Bill Moyers about this in his last book called Journals. He'd also had some in his book on Robert Kennedy. And also Richard Goodwin himself wrote a very interesting book in 1988 called Remembering America, where he had an entire chapter, I think it was chapter 26, like 45 pages, of his growing awareness of Lyndon Johnson's mental issues. I don't know how else to say it. That's what it was about. Go to the library and you read that for yourself. But and unless you factor that into the equation, you will never understand exactly the mental framework that he was looking at his election chances the following year. He expected to be reelected. He thought that the White House was his destiny, had always been his destiny, and that he had a almost guaranteed right to run again and be reelected. And he wanted to ensure, just like he did 4 years before, at this point 3 years before, in 1964, with that other false flag operation called the Gulf of Tonkin attack, a phantom attack that didn't occur. He said it did, and at that time he was still believable for some reason to a lot of people. So the Congress, the House of Representatives, passed that unanimously. The Senate, there were only 2 senators who voted against the Tonkin Gulf resolution, and so the whole thing passed, and they gave him the keys to conduct that war in whatever way he wanted to, and do it on his own timetables, and micromanage the hell out of it. And that's exactly what he did. And so he looked at this as an opportunity. First of all, he was very concerned that it was Jewish people, liberal Jewish people, especially in New York, and Washington, Miami, and Los Angeles, and so forth. All the major cities had turned against him, and that's where all the protests were really emanating from. And they were all being led, at least in his mind, by young Jewish guys who were liberals and who didn't want that war. But he thought that they would go for a war over in the Middle East, and so that was his mindset. It admittedly a deluded mind, but that's you have to consider that. And he thought that this would guarantee him another landslide election in the following year, even at the risk of starting World War III. And I know it sounds absurd. A lot of people are probably, still trying to comprehend all this, but it's a real. This should have been an epic story 50 years ago. 50 years ago, this should have been in every headline of the country, of the world. I mean, it was that epic.
Why do you think the press
didn't? It was hidden.
Why do you think the press didn't cover this back then? They were covering Watergate and stuff. Why not this?
Well, Johnson had bought himself a lot of capital with his progressive legislation in the first 2 years of his presidency, and I guess there was some recognition of that, even despite his horrible Vietnam policies that they all detested so much. I don't know how to say that except for this. It was not just his own influence. It was the CIA acting with him in what had started out as Operation Mockingbird back in the early 50s, right, where many journalists and publishers and newspaper owners around the country, the major newspapers, were all embedded with the CIA in this Operation Mockingbird and being paid, and of course some of their syndicated columnists, for example, all the names, they were being paid off to parrot the CIA line, and that's what happened. There's no other way around it. I'm not sure how I can add to that.
Well, I tell you, this great information. The book is Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas by Philip F. Nelson. His website is lbjmastermind.com. What do you want to leave us with? How can people find you if they want to get a hold of you and book you on the air?
Well, they can contact me through my website. There's a contact information there. And that would probably be just the best way. The book is listed, of course, at Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes & Noble and in some bookstores. This is a smaller publisher, and I'm not sure how many brick-and-mortar type stores might carry it. But I believe this is a condensed version of what should have been an epic story 50 years ago, and we're still trying to deal with the consequences. Those consequences, in my view, are enormous, and you see them every day over on the Gaza Strip, and the fighting that still goes on, and will go on till forevermore, probably, until somebody with a little more sanity comes onto the scene over there.
Mr. Nelson, thank you so much. The book's got great reviews. You check it out there on Amazon and also on the Opperman Report bookstore. Thank you so much, Philip Nelson. The book
You're
is
welcome.
Remember the Liberty. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now a word from our sponsors. Archival Revival, the Christian Film Archive, is currently paying for vintage Christian films. They are dedicated to preserving and restoring classic Christian films and media. So if you have an original prints, negatives, or other film elements of classic Christian films, or you have audio recording masters for classic Christian record albums, they want to buy them from you. So email archival.revival@gmail.com, and they're going to make you an offer. Archival Revival wants to preserve these classic Christian films so that they continue saving people for years. These films have brought people to salvation. They want to continue that. Their staff has decades of experience in handling and preserving of film elements, and they utilize the very best climate-controlled film storage facilities around the world. Contact them today at archival.revival@gmail.com. If there's someone you know has these prints, negatives, recording masters, or other materials from vintage Christian films, you can check out their blog at archivalrevival.blogspot.com. Now, just so you understand, Archival Revival wants to pay you for these films. So you can look in your church attic, in the church basement. If you have a friend who runs a Christian youth ministry, or these youth vacation Bible study camps, they have these old films in those big metal containers, 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter. Archival Revival wants to buy them from you. So this is a sponsor that actually wants to give you money. And all you have to do is contact them, tell them what you have. If you're in the UK or Ireland or Africa, these films are all over the world, and they're gathering dust, and they're going to deteriorate if they don't get into the hands of Archival Revival. So that's archival.revival@gmail.com, or the blog spot is archivalrevival.blogspot.com. Don't forget, this show is brought to you by pscoco.com. Phoebe Sod is an independent curator with the Cocoa Exchange. The Cocoa Exchange is formerly known as Dove Chocolate Discoveries, and they make the finest silky smooth chocolate because the products start with the best cocoa beans, which are tested for quality and flavor by expert technicians. The Cocoa Exchange offers not just premium chocolates, but anything from sauces and spices to brownie and cake mixes, and even coffee and martini mixes. If you wish to treat yourself or someone you love to a sweet and tasty gift, then the Cocoa Exchange is the brand for you. So you go to pscoco.com, you click on the Shop Now button, you can see all their beautiful chocolates. You can order it right now tonight. It could be in your mailbox in a couple of days. Or if you want to get into the chocolate business, you want to be a chocolatier just like Phoebe Sod, you can click the Contact Us button, and you can learn how to get your own website, go into the cocoa chocolate business, and sell chocolate and make a little bit of money there. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. But you also do all the kind of different services for you. An online dating service investigation. It's called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites, and we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, even gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites. If you think your ex-husband or something is addicted to prescription medication or involved in a extreme online pornography addiction, we can produce a report for you that you can use in court. Adoption investigations. If you want to locate your birth parents or your birth child you gave away for adoption, we can do adoption investigations for you. Asset searches for you. Locate bank accounts, hidden assets, hidden properties, hidden income, all different kinds of services in the asset search investigation. Email tracing. If you need to locate or identify somebody from just an email address, we can do an email trace investigation for you, and all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics. where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com.
No topics, no fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. This portion of the show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. Go to emailrevealer.com, get a copy, an autographed copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. Also, too, if you have any kind of you want to do an adoption investigation, if you have a loved one, a biological parent, or biological child that's been separated through the adoption process, we can locate them for you, reunite them with your adopted biological family. Also, to asset searches, locates, all kinds of stuff. Online infidelity investigation. Give us an email address to trace it back to online dating websites. Also, too, don't forget, American Freedom Radio has been on the air for a very long time, and they're struggling now to make their monthly bills. In fact, that the money to run the station is coming out of the owner's pocket rather than from the listeners. There's a deficit each month. So go to AmericanFreedomRadio.com and click on the donate button and check that out. Also, too, real quick, got a lot of big stuff going up in the Opperman Report members section. Really, really great stuff. Today, I got an exclusive interview today. I did at 10 a.m. this morning with the geologist who was there at the scene of McMartin Preschool. He's never been interviewed before in his life about this topic. I have an exclusive document from him about he's an eyewitness to seeing a room that was underneath the garage on the McMartin Preschool. It's not a basement, a real basement. This was something that was dug by amateurs there for some odd reason, and there's a staircase leading down to it. So this kind of confirms what the kids were saying at the time. And I have a way to confirm that through county records coming up. That's it's going to be exclusive to the Opperman Report. Also, too, just recently I interviewed Samantha Spiegel, who's the heir to the Spiegel catalog fame, okay, at Fortune. Okay, and she is the ex-girlfriend of John Mark Carr, who's the character who confessed to the murder of John Benet Ramsey. She has some fascinating stuff to tell us about John Mark Carr, but also other things going on in her life, which is going to be coming up in 2 weeks. We're going to be doing a show, and I'll be able to tell you more about it then. But this is blockbuster stuff. I'm trying to get up there to San Francisco to tape with her, to tape with her sister and her family, and also, too, to tape with Steven Sanzeri about the Yosemite murders. So if you can go to OppermanReport.com and become a member, that would help me finance that trip. I'd like to do it this week while Victoria's out of town. We have with us now the great Ted Rubinstein. Ted, are you there?
I'm here.
Thank you so much. Hey, Ted, tell everybody about yourself. Who is Ted Rubinstein?
Well, I guess you could just call me investigator, or researcher, reader, follower of parapolitical intrigue, which I have done for decades now. Basically started out researching the Kennedy assassination and things that tied into that. I really got into organized crime in a more general, just outside of the Kennedy assassination. A lot of the things I've, been reading about have to do with organized crime in one way or another. And the topic that I wanted to discuss today is
no. Before we get to that, Ted, a couple of questions. How old are you?
64.
64. Okay.
I wish to. Yes.
A young 64.
Thank you.
And you've been doing this a long time. Now, I was saying last night that, because Ted's been around with Mae Brussels, Dave Emery, Larry Flint. This guy is an icon for this kind of information. He contacts me all the time off the air, giving me little tips and hints and, pointing me in the right direction. Great guy to have around. An old, wise elder statesman in this kind of field. And I was saying last
Well, I
night.
appreciate those kind words.
No, it's the truth, man. I was just saying last night. Well, why don't you do like a webinar, to try and teach these young kids who do these YouTube videos and they're just rambling and ranting and raving with their, you know what I mean? To teach them responsible journalism and sober, research. Do a webinar for these kids.
Well, it's an idea, but I don't know if people are really reachable. I mean, people have these fixed ideas in their head of, the way things are and who's involved and all these things. And,
yeah,
they don't want to be dissuaded by the facts in a lot of cases.
I remember one time I asked you, I says, well, what do you think of so-and-so? And you said, well, he's like everyone else. He's wrong half the time. And you really, you put myself in perspective because you're right, man. We're all wrong half the time. We can't let our egos, get the best of us. So I can't thank you enough. You've been a great inspiration to me and a great asset in my life to have someone like you to turn to for advice and for suggestions and stuff. Thank you very much. And also, too, for a guest when I need one and when I'm in a spot.
Right, yeah. You've had some great guests on, and I'm glad to say I've had, my part in bringing some of them to you.
That's right. Everyone who likes the Opera Report should also appreciate Ted Rubinstein for helping us out here. So now you have this thing on your mind lately about Don Bolles. Is that who it is?
Don Bolles, an investigative reporter who was one of the few reporters who's been killed in the line of duty doing his job in this country, because this country is not known, as some other countries are, for reporters being bumped off for what they're reporting on. I mean, those things happen in Italy, happens in Russia, happening now in Mexico on a big scale. But it's virtually unheard of in the U.S. So when it did happen, like in this case, in Arizona in 1976, it made a big splash, and there was concentrated attention by a whole slew of investigative reporters that descended upon Arizona after it happened. But let me start with the facts of the case. It happened on June 2nd, 1976, in Phoenix, Arizona. Don Bolles was an investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic, the leading newspaper in the state. He specialized in organized crime stories. Arizona was a state, part of the great booming Southwest that was the Sun Belt, that was growing a lot in the 60s and 70s. A lot of people were moving in there, including a lot of organized crime types coming from other parts of the country, especially mainly Chicago, but also Cleveland, Detroit, New York.
Yes, still to this day, Sammy the Bull Gravano went out there and he set up shop in Arizona.
And he was in Phoenix.
Yeah.
This is kind of a side issue, side of the tangent, but yeah, after he testified against John Gotti, he moved to Phoenix, and they sort of kept a low profile for a while. But then he adopted the name of a company that he had used previously in New York, and eventually it became known that he was living there. And apparently the Gotti people, the organized crime people back east, had sent out a hit team to look for him. But just before they got to him, he and his sons were arrested in a ecstasy ring.
Right.
That he was running, even under his new identity. So it was pretty sloppy. And he's, I think, still doing time behind that. He got a real cushy sentence, like 19 murders that he was involved in. He got off with a 5-year sentence, and then he messed it up royally with this ecstasy ring, and I he's still in custody.
Yeah, and destroyed his family too. Even his son-in-law got busted in that. His whole family.
Right.
Well, you don't learn your lesson. That's what happens. So.
Okay. So anyway, the organized crime families that moved into the Arizona area included the Licavoli family. Peter Licavoli moved to, he had something called the Grace Ranch around Tucson. And the Bonanos, the Bonanno family, Joe Bonanno and his sons were living in Tucson. And at one point, this is in the 60s, the FBI manufactured this operation, this phony war between the Licavolis and the Bonanos, in which they used the undercover operatives to start fires and do these bombings and try to start a war between the two, a phony war. But then it was revealed that it was the whole thing was staged by the FBI.
Really? What year was that? Was that before COINTELPRO?
Yeah, this would have been like around 68. And this is all written about in Honor Thy Father by Gay Talese.
Really?
Yeah. I believe the FBI agent that was implicated was named Hale. But anyway, that's kind of, again, not totally relevant. But one of the things that Don Bolles wrote about was the Bonanos, the Sons, who they were meeting with at various bars in Phoenix. And, well, whatever information he obtained about mob people in Phoenix and surrounding cities. He was also writing a lot about the dog racing that was going on in tracks in Arizona and other parts of the country. There was a lot of corruption going on in the giving away of the concessions and the way they were regulated. And the Arizona Racing Commission was in bed with the people running the tracks. There were all these conflicts of interest. And the family that was running these racetracks was the Funk family. Now, they were in business with a family that was called the Jacobs family, who set up these racing racetracks and racetrack concessions way back in the 30s, and they got a virtual monopoly on it. And the Funks were involved in running the dog racing in Phoenix. And also Bolles was writing about, because the horse racing and the dog racing were run by the same interests, a lot of the same families. The Racing Commission was regulating it, supposedly. So Don Bolles was getting a lot of tips about, the corruption going on, and he was exposing it in the Arizona Republic. But the Funks were a very powerful family, and they were connected to other powerful families in Arizona, which we'll get to, like the Goldwaters and the Rosenzweig. Goldwater's the main name that would be familiar to you and the listeners. But anyway, so at some point, the Funks were able to get the Arizona Republic to tell Bolles. I think the Funks sued at some point, and so it was a harassment suit, and it was going to cost the Arizona Republic money to fight it. And the Funks were a very powerful family, and they're connected to other powerful families in Arizona. And they were able to get Bolles taken off the beat, writing about the dog racing and the horse racing. He was also writing about land fraud in Arizona, which was a huge, booming business for a lot of fraudsters and organized crime figures that were making money hand over fist, variety of different frauds they were doing. One of them was selling land to people that were like servicemen that were serving overseas in Japan, Okinawa, and so on, conning them into, thinking that they were getting, nice, homestead or whatever in Arizona, and of course there's no water. It's just worthless.
Right.
So that was a huge thing that was going on. It was beginning to get some national attention, all the land fraud that was going on in Arizona.
I remember back in New York in the 80s, I met this guy. I forget the magazine, but it was a pornographic magazine, like one of the. It wasn't like Penthouse. It was like Sherry or one of those, And what he did was he had a little tiny ad in the classifieds in the back of that magazine, and he used to sell land, investment land, up in Canada. You know, so he would buy this big plot of land in Canada and then chop it up into little plots, and it was all swampland. It was all worthless, you know. And he was an organized crime guy.
It's a common scam.
Yeah, it's a common. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that was his deal. The guy had a ton of money, so I guess it was along those same lines there.
And also, another thing they would do is they would use the same piece of property as collateral for all kinds of different loans.
Right.
Another scam that they were doing. Anyway, a lot of this was run by a guy named Ned Warren, whose real name was Nathan Waxman. And he came from the East Coast. He was apparently directed by East Coast organized crime figures to conduct these land fraud operations in Arizona. And partly due to the result of Don Bolles' stories, he was charged. And some of his people along with him were charged with these frauds. And I was going to say, I'm reading 2 books on the Bolles case right now, but before I read those books, I read another book by the son of a murdered witness who was going to testify against this Ned Warren. He was killed in Phoenix in a parking lot stairwell, gangland style, in 1975. And the killers dropped some coins on his body to indicate that he'd been talking. And anyway, that was kind of a mistake, because that caused the murder to get a lot of attention as a mob murder. That brought all this heat on Ned Warren. The murdered guy was named Ed Lazar. And at that point, Ned Warren was, he wasn't convicted of the murder, but he was convicted of some of these frauds. And so this brings us to 1976, and Don Bolles got a tip from one of his informants who he knew to be a criminal connected to underworld elements in Phoenix named John Harvey Adamson. And he was going to meet him at the Clarendon Hotel in downtown Phoenix on June 2nd, 1976. But Adamson didn't show. The Bolles was stood up for the meeting. So he leaves the hotel, he gets into his car, starts to back up, and it blows up. He was gravely injured. He did survive for a couple of weeks, 10 days or something. But his legs were blown off. But his last words before he slipped on unconsciousness were, "Emprise, Mafia, they got me. Find Adamson." Now, Emprise, as I said, was in charge of the dog tracks and the racetrack concessions. They started out of Buffalo. I didn't mention that before. The Jacobs family started out of Buffalo, but the Funks were, who they were in business with, they were in Arizona. But the Funks and Emprise are all connected. And they're connected to the Mafia. I didn't mention that. I know that there's just a whole slew of connections that the Jacobs family had with organized crime figures going back to when they first got into this business in the 30s. That's one of the things that Bolles had been writing about, but it also got a lot of national attention in places. This is like 1972. It got a big attention in Sports Illustrated and some of the national media, the corruption. And then even Frank Sinatra was called in connection with those hearings.
Oh, really? What was his involvement?
Yeah. I believe he was a part owner of one of the racetracks.
Okay.
I believe. This is like 1972. So anyway, okay, so when he dies, he names Emprise, Mafia, and Adamson. Adamson is arrested really quickly and charged with it. And he quickly confesses in part. And one of the people that gets implicated in this thing quickly is a lawyer, a very shady lawyer named Neil Roberts. And because of all the powerful interests in Arizona, which had influence both with the Phoenix Police Department and with the Arizona Republic, and of course the state legislature, the Racing Commission, you name it. There's rampant corruption, and I didn't mention this. All this prostitution and gambling going on there, and it's apparently protected by the Goldwater family and his pals. So anyway, very early on, there's apparent intention to narrow the focus of the investigation, and they make a real cushy deal with this lawyer named Neil Roberts. And this is so outrageous, the deal they made with this guy. I mean, because he's implicated to the hilt in the thing. They know right off the bat that he's connected to Adamson, that he's connected to everybody that wants Bolles dead. And get this, he has an office that overlooks a parking lot where the day of the bombing, he reports 3 different cars have been stolen from outside his office. Now, it develops later in this investigation that apparently these cars were all taken by people that wanted to get out of town in a hurry,
right,
after the bombing, and he helped them get out of town. And this should have been so totally obvious to the police. This is just one of the things that implicated Roberts in the murders. But they make a deal with him where they'll give him immunity in exchange for his theory on what happened. So this guy, who's, I believe either he or one of the Funks to be the mastermind of the crime, from my reading of the books. Now, let me say, the books that I'm reading, one is called a recent book. It's called The Politics of Murder, Organized Crime in Barry Goldwater's Arizona, by Dave Wagner, who used to write for the Arizona Republic and the Phoenix Gazette. The other book I'm reading is an earlier book by private investigator Lake Headley, who was a practicing PI in Las Vegas, a really crackerjack PI, recognized as such by Vincent Bugliosi and a whole lot of others as one of the top PIs that they've ever encountered. So he was hired.
Wait, Headley, what's Headley's book?
Loud and Clear.
Loud and Clear, okay. I looked up Headley.
Now, I met him when I was at the, I met him in '84 when I was working at the Rebel, but I don't know if he was working on this case then or not. I don't remember in what capacity I met him and what he was working on, but I did meet him.
Well, I looked him up after you mentioned his name to me, and he was hired by the Hearst family to investigate the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and back then he had proof that Patty Hearst was dating that guy Sing Q, Donald DeFreeze, before the kidnapping. Mm-hmm. You heard that whole story by Brad Schreiber, right?
Well, I'm very familiar with the SLA case.
Right.
I don't know if Brad Schreiber said anything I was not already familiar with.
Oh, really? Okay.
But I did not know that he had an involvement in the Patty Hearst case.
Yeah.
I know that at some point didn't Hearst go to Mickey Cohen to see if he could help out?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that one. I never heard that.
Okay, Lake Headley wrote this other book.
Yeah.
And he was hired, when they made this deal with this crooked lawyer, Neil Roberts, actually, this information came from Adamson. They made a deal with Adamson that if you tell the truth, supposedly, you'll escape the electric chair. You'll be out in 20 years. Which I forget exactly, but anyway. So they agreed to make this cushy deal where Neil Roberts has immunity, and Adamson, if he tells his story, he won't get the death penalty. So anyway, he implicates these 2 people named Max Dunlap and Jim Robinson. Max Dunlap supposedly delivers money, or he admits delivering money just as a favor to a friend. He admits delivering money to this lawyer, Neil Roberts, bunch of money, just as a favor. He didn't know what the money was for. He delivered the money to Neil Roberts, and John Harvey Adamson was in the office when this money was delivered. So that's how he was implicated in the thing. And Adamson claims that this other guy was a plumber who had knowledge of explosives. His name is Jim Robinson. Okay, the guy who delivered the money was Max Dunlap. The guy who supposedly was said by Adamson to have made the bomb and to have triggered it with the remote control device in the parking lot was Jim Robinson. Now, the evidence against these guys was real flimsy. And the defense committee for those two hired Lake Headley to be their investigator and see, what was being covered up, if anything, and who the real culprits were. Now, according to Neil Roberts' theory, the mastermind of the bombing, the car bombing, was this guy named Kemper Marley. Kemper Marley was a Arizona mogul who was in the racing business. I think he was a rival of the Funks, but I'm not sure. But anyway, Bolles had written about him a few years earlier, and his stories had cost Marley an appointment he was hoping to get. So the theory, according to Roberts and Adamson's scenario, was that Marley wanted revenge for the stories that Bolles had written in the past. But Lake Headley realized that that doesn't make any sense. Why kill a reporter for something he already did? And Marley is it wasn't that he went bankrupt as a result of this or any of this. He didn't really suffer very much. But Lake Headley and others quickly deduced that it was much more likely that Bolles was killed for a story he was about to write. Mm. And I already said that the Arizona Republic had taken him off the the racing stories. However, he was a bulldog, and he wasn't going to let, just because his bosses didn't want him writing about it, he was going to find a way to write about it and study it on his own or for another source. And in fact, not only was he stringing for Newsweek at that point, but he was also writing for a weekly paper, and it's believed that he was continuing to study the Funk family and the Emprise connections, not for his most steady employer, the Arizona Republic, but for the other outlets that he was working for. So Headley believed that very likely the Funk family and Emprise was very likely behind it. And I don't want to get into all the details, but he gets a lot of witnesses and sources that flesh that out, that show that the Funk, one of the Funks particularly, who displayed very erratic behavior, that he, swore revenge. He was out to get Bolles, and he knew Roberts, and so he was very likely involved. And I do believe that my reading of the evidence certainly suggests that that Funk and Roberts seem to have been the prime movers in the plot. Okay, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, was anybody actually convicted on this?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Adamson, pleaded guilty. Both, and just on the basis of his testimony alone, Robinson and Dunlap were convicted. And when Headley got into the case, they'd already convicted, and so he was working on overturning the case, which he eventually did. The case was overturned on appeal, and Robinson died. Dunlap died in custody because he was retried on the same testimony, even though Adamson had reneged on fully doing his part of the commitment. But anyway, I'm a little vague on some of the details. But anyway, on the retrial in 1993, they were convicted again. One of them died in custody, and the other one died out of custody on a further appeal. I believe one of them was convicted of soliciting to kill Adamson, the witness who had apparently falsely implicated one of them in the whole thing. I think one of them was serving that sentence when he died. Anyway, that was who that's who Headley was representing in the defense case. And Marley was, they never were able to get Marley because they just didn't have enough evidence. But as I said, Headley believes that it was very weak motive on his part. Now, let me tell you what happened after the bombing happened. As I said, everyone was in an outrage that a U.S. reporter was murdered for doing his job. And quickly, a team of investigative reporters from all over the country was assembled. They were called the Investigative Reporters and Editors. I think the head of it was Bob Green out of Newsday, out of Long Island. I believe he headed up the whole thing. And I forget how many reporters were involved. It was a whole bunch of print reporters and also some radio reporters I know were involved. Anyway, they spent 6 months just totally enveloping themselves into what was going on in Arizona and what Don Bolles had been covering. And they ended up, after 6 months, doing like a 23-part, really detailed series about organized crime in Arizona. Just an incredible amount of wealth of detail. And it really went into, how the Goldwaters were corrupt, and some of the other high power brokers in Arizona and how they were untouchable. And they did a bang-up job of exposing the general situation of organized crime in Arizona, but where they really fell down on the job was they didn't pursue the murder the way they should have and question the job that the Phoenix Police Department was doing. Because it turned out, and you really get this from reading both these books, the depth of the malfeasance that went into effect because to protect these vested interests. I mean, the newspaper didn't go after the probe like they should have, investigating Neil Roberts and his motives, and I already said that they'd already agreed not to investigate the racing stuff, and they pulled Bolles off that aspect even before he was murdered. But what the most galling thing of all was the conduct of the Phoenix Police Department that Lake Headley exposes in his book. I mean, to the extent that they went through the files at one point of the Phoenix Police Department, removing every single page that had incriminating information about Emprise or the Funks or Goldwater or connections to Adamson. They totally sanitized the file, and they had it renumbered so that you wouldn't know that the pages were missing.
Wow.
So outright destruction of evidence. And he names the guy involved, like the lead investigator, John Sellers, gets named in all these books. And what really galls me is I was looking up some of the articles that appeared, like in the Arizona Republic, in the like they did an article that appeared 40 years afterwards, which was, I guess, 2016, that would be 40 years after 76. And they're quoting this John Sellers like they call him a retired investigator, but with no mention of the fact that he totally sanitized the file, destroyed evidence, so that he's got some sort of credibility. I was shocked with this. So, the corruption and the cover-up is just astounding.
What about Goldwater? Does this come out in Goldwater's history, in his biography and stuff like that, officially?
I don't know, but I do know this, that like Richard Nixon, he got his start in politics by getting a pretty nice donation from an organized crime figure.
Oh, really?
Now, I believe Nixon's career started when he got a big donation from Mickey Cohen, as I remember, who I mentioned earlier. And I believe that Goldwater got his, this is mentioned in one of these two books, that he got his political start after getting a big contribution from organized crime figure Willie Beoff. Now, Willie Beoff, he testified in one of the mob shakedowns of the studios, I think in the 40s this was. He testified against Rosselli and a bunch of others. And then he moved to Arizona, but he didn't really keep his identity secret. Like everyone, who he palled around with knew who he really was, that he had testified in this mob trial involving the movie studios. So anyway, he's the one who gave this payoff to Goldwater. And anyway, he got blown up in his car in the 50s when the organized crime interests back in Chicago find out that he was living there openly, lording it over the fact that he had testified against them and was gotten away with it. So they blew him up. Car bombings were pretty popular. There was another guy named Louis Bompacino. He got blown up in his car. He was, I think, a protected witness. He got blown up in 1975. Anyway.
Yeah, my neighbor, DeChico, I think her name was Diane DeChico, on Staten Island. She moved into my condo because her husband had gotten car bombed. They thought that it was the Genovese family did it. Frank DeChico. Frank DeChico, right. Right. He was John Gotti's. John Gotti was supposed to be in that car, but he wasn't. Right. He wasn't there, and so they used they used a remote control from an airplane.
Really?
Yeah, that you remote control an airplane with. That's what they used to set the bomb off. And
mini war between the Genoveses and the Gottis, right?
Wasn't even really a war. It was just like a one-time thing, from what I understood. But the guys from the Genovese family who were around, who knew what went on with that, okay? Firsthand, they knew what went on, were the guys who were shaking me down in my nightclub. So they would come to my condo on Staten Island and pass her husband in the hallway, walking back and forth.
Huh.
They killed her husband.
Interesting.
And I know one of the guys too that was involved in all that. It turned out later on we found out he had two families. He had two sets of families. He was married and had kids on Staten Island with this woman, and then along the way he met this stripper in New Jersey and married her. Had another house in New Jersey with her, and the one on Staten Island didn't know about it. She didn't find out about it until they filed for divorce, and then it all came out in the divorce. Oh, God. But take us back to Arizona. How does this whole thing end up here?
Well, I mean, I guess it ended up that there was really no resolution, indicated that justice was served. Adamson's, he died in jail. And as I say, Adamson and Robinson, if they played any role at all, it was a very minor one, and yet they, were convicted as if they were major players. And Neil Roberts totally escaped prosecution. And the Funks escaped prosecution. And I guess the only good thing that came out of it was the fact that the investigative reporters and editors continues to survive as an investigative reporting body, even though they didn't do much to solve the murder of Don Bolles. They do continue to do good investigative work in the area of organized crime and a lot of other things.
And they gave this guy some kind of award too, right? Don Bolles, like a statue and stuff like that. I see on his Wikipedia page. But like, what about the local reporters there down there? You know.
Oh, I didn't mention.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. One of the reporters that Headley worked with was a reporter for the Scottsdale Progress, Scottsdale, Arizona, named Don Devereaux. Don Devereaux is a really ace investigative reporter who does a lot of stories. A lot of them have to do with organized crime, but a lot of stories that other people were not doing. And I believe, and I'm almost positive of this, that Don Devereaux was familiar to Danny Casolaro, and that Danny Casolaro was interested in some of the things that Devereaux was pursuing. Now, Devereaux has a website and has he's been putting up a lot of stories about corruption in Arizona, the Don Bolles murder, different aspects of that. He's got a couple there about Bonanno. And anyway, he was working with Headley, and at one point, this was while the appeals process was going on, Lake Headley was living, was it Flag? I forget where he was living at the time, but he had a young lady working for him as an investigator, and they developed a romance, and they were living together. And the apartment they were living in was apparently the subject of an arson attack. And this is where I mentioned to you before off the air of our private message that Pelicano's name turns up in this case.
Okay.
So anyway, as a result of the arson attack, Lake Headley was injured, but his girlfriend, who ran back into the apartment where it was burning to try to save him, she was more badly burned than he was. In fact, she was lucky to survive at all. She had burns over large portions of her body. She barely recovered, but she finally did. And they were investigating to see how this blaze occurred. And they came to this scenario that it had been caused by a container of ether being left near a hot water heater, and that two hot water faucets were turned on. Now I don't know how this works, but supposedly once the water drains or something, causes the pilot to come on or something, and that would cause the fumes from the ether to ignite.
And why would someone have?
Supposedly what Pelicano. This is what supposedly Pelicano deduced from studying the scene, and they said that Pelicano was not only one of the best. This is 1980 that they're talking about, before he got scandalized. That he was not only one of the top 5 private investigators in the country, but that he was also a premier investigator of arson.
Really? Well, he did have the best PR agent as far as PIs go, but the top 5 press agents as far as PIs go, that's for sure. But what would someone be doing with a can of ether in their home? You have any idea how that came up?
The arsonist put the can of ether there.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, that's an unusual way to do arson. Yeah.
This seems to be a strange way to ignite ether by turning on hot water faucets. It just seems screwy to me.
Yeah, that's. And who hired Pelicano to get involved in this thing?
I don't know if he was actually hired. I mean, I guess he would have to be hired.
No. Pelicano was notorious for inserting himself.
Committee that especially once they did an attack on the investigator and his girlfriend, I'm sure they were able to spring the money. Some people were able to raise the money to hire Pelicano to look into at least this aspect of it.
Yeah, because Pelicano was notorious for inserting himself into cases. He would go do the wiretaps and then contact the lawyers and contact sometimes both sides, and then say, okay, I got the goods. You want to hire me? and he would insert himself in. That takes a lot of balls.
Yeah, I don't think that happened in this case, though.
Okay.
This didn't involve any wiretaps that I know of.
Right.
At least not on Lake Headley.
Okay, right.
But anyway,
Yeah. Did they ever solve who
I
what?
guess mainly the story as I know it. It's certainly a shameful episode in American journalism that they didn't get to the bottom of it. That the killers got away with it, basically. But it's not as big a stain on American journalism as the tragic tale of Gary Webb.
Yeah. Now, Webb, I've talked to a lot of people about Webb. I've even talked, Freeway Rick Ross and the whole crew. Now, a lot of them seem to think that it was a suicide.
That it was or wasn't?
That it was.
Oh, I'm one of those.
Okay, yeah.
Because I thought you were going to say the opposite, because I find very few people that are willing to say, well, yes, he probably did kill himself. And the reason for that is because you know that it took 2 bullets to kill him.
Yeah, right.
That's very rare. And then some people even, they gild the lily by saying it was 2 bullets to the back of his head.
Right,
I don't think that's accurate. But anyway, it is very rare for someone to shoot themselves twice in order to commit suicide, but it is not. It has been done before, and I think just the reason I came to this conclusion is studying the circumstances of the case, the note found on the door, in his writing, the precautions he took that his body not be found by anybody. It just didn't. It seemed like way too elaborate. In other words, it didn't seem at all like the Danny Casolaro suicide. It seemed genuine just from what the picture that I got of it. It seemed plausible to me that he killed himself, although he was brought to that point.
Right. Yeah, he was driven to suicide.
They hounded him into it.
Career, right. Which is a perfect example of what we started the show off talking about, how it's enough of a story. It's enough of a story that he was driven to suicide because he had this information. It was a bulldog. The way he investigated that case, he was brought on for the defense of Freeway Rick Ross. That's enough of a story. Why do we have to make it that then he was also killed at the end?
Well, but the thing that really gets me is the CIA basically conceded so much of what he wrote, and even went beyond that, and yet the news media pretends that doesn't exist. That the CIA did not admit to all these things, that the report never existed, and that Gary Webb was a discredited journalist. I mean,
right?
They will never admit that they were wrong on anything, and this, of course, holds true of the Kennedy assassination. But in the Gary Webb case, I mean, basically, he was proved right, and yet they still try to pretend, including the writer for the Mercury that Webb wrote for. I'll name him Scott Herhold. He continues to put out the myth that Gary Webb was not a very good reporter, that he was sloppy. I mean, it's just so outrageous.
Right.
I get pissed off just thinking about it.
Yeah, the last thing you could say was sloppy. Get brought in. A reporter would be brought in on somebody's defense. Practically ran the defense of that case too. Hey, let me ask you.
What gets me?
Yeah, go ahead.
He wrote this like 30-page series of articles before he even got involved in the Mercury and the CIA. He wrote this incredible investigative series about crime in the coal fields back in the East Coast. He wrote for the Kentucky Post and the Cincinnati Post. Just a mind-boggling piece of investigative journalism. I mean, this guy had really proven his chops way before the Mercury even hired him. And for them to say, oh, he's not a good investigative reporter, I mean, it was so galling.
Let me change the topic here a bit. What do you make of all this stuff with the Russians and Trump and all this stuff, like the Russian collusion? What do you? You're watching all this. What do you come with?
Well, again, this shows my bias, but I'm more interested in the connections he has to the Russian crime figures and the Russian mafia and the money laundering, and why all these people are buying condos or whatever it is he offers at Trump Tower.
Right.
I mean, I read these skeptics saying, well, what kind of influence do they think they're getting by buying homes in Trump Tower. I don't know, but I don't think there's. I think this. It's like, where do you go with this? What are they going to do? If they decide that the Russians did collude with Trump, what are they going to do? Give the election to Hillary? I mean, first of all, I think if it was really as serious and they had, the goods that they claimed, it would have leaked by now, because everything in this story is leaking. Most of it apparently from the FBI, from what I gather.
Yeah.
I just think there's not a whole lot there, and what there is getting, kind of downplayed. And as I say, I think it's the organized crime angles, because this guy Trump, he's been in bed with mobsters all over the world for as long as he's been in business, it looks like.
Yeah, this makes me want to take another look at the purchase of the yacht from Khashoggi, and then the purchase of Mar-a-Lago when Mar-a-Lago was being built for Khashoggi, and somehow Trump. I got a feeling that was money laundering as well.
Yeah, they never touched that stuff either.
Oh, and Khashoggi just died, and they never touched it.
Yeah, you're right. I know. You were so excited about that. Why did they mention it? If they hate Trump so much, why not capitalize on a story like that? But they don't.
Well, you know what I just found out?
They miss these opportunities.
Well, because, you're right. There's an agenda, You know what I just found out, too, I'm working on it this week, is with the Clinton Foundation, when they were robbing Haiti for all that earthquake money, the company where that money was going to was Jeb Bush was on the board of directors of that company that was making those little tiny houses that was supposedly going to wind up someday in Haiti, and Wesley Clark was involved in it. Jeb Bush was involved in it, and Barack Obama had a connection to this whole thing.
Which Clark?
Wesley Clark. General Wesley Clark was on the board of directors, too.
Really?
Yeah.
That's new information you're getting.
I know, it is. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. And
now,
yeah.
What about, I need to listen. You had Peter Schweitzer on talking about his book about the Clinton Foundation, right?
Not Peter Schweitzer, no, Charles Ortel.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You had a different guy.
Yeah, Peter Schweitzer. I'll get him. Yeah, I'd love to talk about Clinton Foundation.
Now, did you hear that one of these overseeing companies that looks into whether a charity is on the up and up, Charity Watch or something, that they gave the Clinton Foundation really high marks?
Yeah.
As most of the money is going where it's supposed to go, it's not corrupt, blah, blah, blah. Have you heard this?
I've heard something like that, yeah.
So I just don't know what to make of these stories. I mean...
Well, the Clintons, it seems like they're...
They seem like grifters. The bottom line is they seem like grifters to me.
Oh, absolutely.
But whether the foundation bears that out, I don't know.
Oh, no, listen to Charles Ortel. He's done some fascinating work on this. They don't even have their paperwork straight. They use the same 501(c)(3) that was set up to found the Clinton Library is running the Clinton Foundation. They haven't done the basic paperwork on this thing. They went after Trump's charity foundation, which was a total scam. But, if they went after Clinton's with the same scrutiny, forget it. They'd be under the prison. If anybody was ever investigating the Clintons, no one investigated them. Except those weak-ass Republican Whitewater stuff, everything was covered up and washed, They should have called it whitewash instead of whitewater, right? And Vince Foster, yeah.
They certainly stayed away from Mina.
Oh, what? Oh,
I guess there was one congressman. Was it Dan Burton? He was interested in Dan Lassiter and some of the Angel Fire, New Mexico development, and Patsy Thomason.
Hey,
he was kind of a bulldog, but most of them no. They want to avoid all the really salient areas of investigation.
Have you read the FOIA request for Linda Ives' FOIA request that her attorney put together?
No, I haven't. Now, apparently they're trying to get files. I mean, Arkansas State Police, FBI. You'd expect them they have files, but apparently they want CIA and NSA files and stuff. Is that right?
DHS too. They're asking for everybody. Yeah, they're at a they're at a stalemate right now. They're stalled. We need to get them an expert. But if you read the FOIA request,
but they know the files exist. They're asking for specific files that they know exist.
No, they need an expert to help them. Okay, Ted, we're out of time. Thank you so much, brother. I'll be talking to you soon.
All right. Great show.
Thank you, man. Okay, well, there you had it. We're out of time with Ted Rubinstein, one of my favorite guests, and really a cool guy to know off the air. Great advisor and consigliere, my rabbi, you might say, good old Ted Rubinstein over there. Fame of Larry Fink Publications and Dave Emery and May Brussel. So my God, what more can you ask for? If you're in this kind of a business, to have a guy like Ted Rubinstein at the other end of a phone, you can call him up or text him on Facebook. Okay, big stuff coming up, guys. Big stuff. As I mentioned before, today I interviewed with a geologist who was there at the scene of the McMartin preschool. I have exclusive information from him. An exclusive document from him. No one's ever interviewed him before in his entire life on this topic. I'm the only one. He's not that hard to find either. Okay, it just goes to show you what's going on out there. Everybody wants to talk about how they're doing this and they're doing that. Ooh. Okay. Now, he's put me on a trail here where I can get county records from the county register down there, from the property records and stuff like that, where we can get official state-sponsored. What is this stuff I'm looking for? We can go to the Department of Building and Safety for grading and building. The geology reports that it's going to be there. We can find this stuff, guys. Okay, and put this whole not myth, but this whole whitewash to rest once and for all. Because this man saw with his own eyes, and I believe him. He saw the room, an excavated room, dug by hand underneath the garage on the property of the McMartin preschool. After so what happened? They raised the preschool in order to pay their legal fees. The property was turned over to the lawyers. Okay, so I interviewed him today. That's going up in the members section, along with a copy of the original archaeological report and his special document that he sent just to me that I'm the only one who has, plus the exclusive interview. That will be in the members section. I'm interviewing tomorrow Neil Sanders. That's going to be playing next Friday. Neil Sanders is coming back. I have a show with him in the members section, but we're going to be talking about a new book he put out about Charles Manson. I got a show coming up Monday I'm taping about the Zodiac. Once again, the Zodiac is the most prolific serial killer out there who had more children than anyone else. Everyone's related to the Zodiac. This woman has her uncle. She claims her uncle is the Zodiac. She's working on a film about it. But there's also a connection to the Escape from Alcatraz story, which I think she's on target with that a little bit more than Zodiac. But I have not verbally interviewed her yet, just chatted back and forth. I'm trying to make a trip up to San Francisco. I just had an interview this week with Samantha Spiegel, for an heir of the Spiegel catalog fortune. Get a hold of that. And she's living up in San Francisco. And I've been talking to her off the air. And we did a 90-minute interview, something like that. Okay? She was the girlfriend of John Mark Carr, who's the guy who confessed to murdering John Benet Ramsey, the crazy guy. She met him when she was 9 years old. He was a teacher's aide at her school. All kinds of wacky stuff going on at her school, by the way, too. This woman has stories to tell. There are some other things about this that I'm not prepared to discuss yet on it, but I want to do further interviews with her on film and her family members. There's there's a book coming out in a couple of weeks. We're going to have them on this show in 3 weeks. We're just getting permission from all the people we can talk about it. Okay? But this is big stuff. Bohemian Grove. Okay, big stuff, guys, okay, that we're talking about here. I can also tape with Stephen Sanzari, who's the PI in the, the Kerry Stayner Yosemite serial killer case that we've been talking about. I know my name is Stephen. Okay, Stephen Sanzari is the PI in that. He's up in that area too. If I can get my butt up to San Francisco this week while Victoria's in Boston, I can tape. We can do some real serious documentary film work. I got the guy up there, the filmmaker. He's ready to do all this, as part of a team, putting in his efforts for not for free, but as part of a speculation that we can sell these stories. And also too, we can also tape with Mike Mooney, who was the Modesto B, I think it was. He was a reporter up there who knows the story about Sterry Stanley. Also knows about Lacey Peterson and a couple other things as well, too. This is big stuff, guys. So I need your support. If you can go to the member section, okay? All these things are going to be in the member section. You don't get this stuff without being in the member section. OppermanReport.com. I got to raise money this week. We only need like 10 memberships, man. You give me like a year. Okay, I'll give you another deal, too. Maybe I'll do a broadcast. I'll do a special audio tape YouTube channel about it. I'll give you 13 months for $69 if you pay me directly via PayPal. So you email me at oppermanreport@gmail.com. I'll give you 13 months for $69. I had a special at the beginning of the month, and I stopped it, but this is a special just to get up there to San Francisco this week. I got to do it in the next 24 hours to get this money to get up there. So keep me in mind there, guys, please. OppermanReport@gmail.com to PayPal. Otherwise, if you just want to go to OppermanReport.com and just become a member there, a month, 3 months, whatever you can do to get me these funds to get up to San Francisco to do this filming. We got a lot of great content. This is exclusive stuff you're not hearing anywhere else. Okay, got to go. Thank you so much. Coming up next is William Ramsey. Great stuff about the conquest of Spain. I'm not sure what it's about. Okay, but he always has great content. Thank you so much, guys. Good night.